it was a lot easier to answer this or talk about it in voice and vid. Context, first of all, turned the camera and my position because the light at the moment coming in from the window I usually sit in front of right now would turn me into a glowing, scary forehead person. And so I canted things. Other context, you see here some of the office redesign in work. These pictures are going to go up and around. Got this new cool shelf happening here. The bookshelf behind me is overflow. I'm embarrassed that this one happens to be behind me. The one right there is beautifully organized. Got my kid pictures in the plexiglass box. I got that cool saber-tooth tiger up there. I got all my, games and magazines and stuff that I need all the time. Are like all beautiful. So then there's the one behind me, which is where all the things get shoved as I do other shelves. So anyway, let's get to the point. We are discussing the context in which some community elsewhere is perceived to have a problem, and a squad is going to arrive, and they are armed. They are basically in a state of enforcement. They may be humanitarian in their motives. They may represent, they say, specific ideals to which they are either going to have these other people live up to because they agreed to do it, or because these people need it so badly that one just has to go help these people. This is super, super embedded in pop culture. And I'm really glad that you brought it up, Tommy, in the context of role-playing. I think that role-playing itself and the hobby itself is shot through and through with despicable elements, far beyond the usual identifiable, easily and widely known despicable elements. And I want to mention, because they have been mentioned, that I consider both Dogs in the Vineyard and Circle of Hands in different ways to be direct, explicit defiance of this model. Whether people have picked up on that in play, particularly for Dogs in the Vineyard, is, well, it's not only debatable, it's tragically unmet. But therefore, those two games, I think, are not in the purview of what you're talking about. A couple of other games that also should be mentioned in this regard include 316. But the games that conform precisely to what you're talking about are Legion, just like they're Legion for TV shows, comics, movies, documentaries, alleged history presentations in mass media and so forth. So therefore, yes, this is a problem. This is a concern. This is a topic of interest. And again, speaking to Tommy, you're fairly soft pedaling it. Don't you think that what if those people could do it differently? Okay, no, let's be blunt. We are talking about the abuse, the exercise and abuse of power as internalized by those who are inflicting it. Is there any good in any of that? Is there something to that? Well, people have struggled to make it good. The classic American example is to actually remove the active individual from the institutions of power so that that person is themselves alienated, person or persons, but usually one, alienated and ambiguous in their own morality, so that they end up, in the better works, the whole thing becomes kind of a discourse on the topic, as well as, a fun drama to watch and everything. But it doesn't really boil down to the good man shows up, and you can see it very clearly in the detective tradition of literature. You can see, the famous quote, by Raymond Chandler, down these mean streets, a man must go, sort of thing. And then contrast that to the works of Dashiell Hammett, James M. Cain, and Ross MacDonald, who I think were all much superior writers to Chandler and had a far less rosy view. Or at least as Chandler in that essay, some of his own stories I think are quite good in maintaining that the detective is not, the light of virtue. Now this is tricky too, because what you do is you give your dude, you give your man who has gone down the mean streets, whether riding into town on his on his tired horse, or whether showing up with the squad of idealistic, determined, and not quite yet trusting one another Marines, or any of these notions of the team or the person showing up and showing these people what's what. Okay, one way to do it is to make them unsavory in some fashion. There are two time-honored ways to do this. One of them, the tropes people call bad butt, which I think is hilarious, where you make them swear and smoke and be kind of cranky and reluctant and basically edgy, but everything they do is just the ordinary white knight stuff. It's just they kind of talk a mean game about it. Then the other way, which is supposed to be the grown-up way, which is where you actually have that person do some bad things, but that's easy. All you have to do is make the bad people worse. And that's fun. We get to see all sorts of cruelty porn from them. And then the edgy things, or the ruthless things, or the, oh, see, it's not about good and evil. It's gray versus gray. Bullshit. The human eye spots the relative badness and is done. And we're, that you're in the same old story. It's just adult now, grown up, mature somehow. Okay, so there's this huge range of presentation, and then you just change the idiom, update the generation, and change the culture, set it somewhere else. All of this has some really interesting aspects of presentation in this or that case. An excellent example is The Seven Samurai. Film by Kurosawa. Is it or is it not in this tradition? And the answer is, it looks like it, to the point where every single revision of that, or representation of that story, does conform. Does the original conform? Question. Second, a good example, and probably one that's going to, release a shitstorm of expert opinion, is For a Fistful of Dollars, the film by Sergio Leone, which stars Clint Eastwood. And perhaps some of the related ones, which are not the same film, particularly... we'll just go into some of the other films if necessary. Well, the point here is that is this person, or whatever, in some cases, the hero who is showing the people and changing things, the right way, and at the very least extirpating, the evil, and then you can have him be as bad as you want to be edgy, because the evil is not just bad, it is evil. Then you can also switch it around where the people who need to be taught a thing or two, some one or individual is innocent, or some one or individual is noble, right? And so then there's sort of this meeting of minds and so on. Special points if you've got an ethnic cross in that particular interaction. I mean, now we're nuanced. Well, okay. Let's take a look and see whether there are reasonable subversions or defiances of this out there at all. That would be where I start talking about Dogs in the Vineyard and Circle of Hands. But let's go back and say, all right, what about all the examples in role-playing And I think the ill there is present very much as it is present in pop culture in general. And that leads to an incredibly important point for me, which is that role-playing as an activity is not pop culture in general. It is not captive to the distribution and economic concerns of all of the others. The extreme desire of many role players for it to be exactly that, I regard as disgusting and itself a form of evil. So that means that when I see role-playing design and topics which are, great and exciting because they are recapitulating or, for that matter, just licensing things that have all of this in it, I'm out. I'm out. And the next step then is, what do we do as players? Because you can have a game that comes to you and it is rife with that particular point of view in its presentation, but possibly not in its execution, because the book is the book and your table is your table. So somebody says, I'm going to be playing this. I mean, are we going to be up in arms and say colonial, racist, and this and that? Well, let's see what they do at the table. That is the artistic work. That is the creative work. That is the activity. And it may well be that this table becomes a textbook of all of those things. All of the, you're celebrating colonialism and racism, and you're celebrating paternalism of so-called humanitarian intervention, and even getting a little charge out of it when you blow the guy's head off because that one's revanchist and refuses to listen, and that one is evil because he eats babies or something. And so you are able to enjoy the blowing of the head off for purposes of your humanitarianism. Well, perhaps that table is a textbook example thereof. Perhaps that table is a textbook example thereof by a bunch of people who consider themselves to be progressives and nothing like those terrible other role players, who are, in fact, in many cases, terrible. I give you that hands down. So still, though, we're just seeing brands of terrible here, and I'm not particularly averse to calling it out. But same game, right? We can take a game that has echoes of this in it, or was written in a context where that was not at the moment, or in the minds of the creators, was not subject to critique. It wasn't on their mind to critique, but the game itself merely has echoes of it, and there's a wide range of available things to play about that stuff. Or the game actually could be reasonably explicit, but either way, in that regard. But either way, the table says, by design or not, right? I'm not talking about on purpose. Well, not on verbal purpose, but through their human activities and their intent as revealed through action and intuition on their part as they play, they produce something that is not, that turns out to be. And I don't mean just like, be ironic about it or, call it out by doing it or anything like that. No, we can get a story that is of its own in this regard. And there are a few times I have tried this with some degree of self-awareness, but without trying to force it, because that kind of ruins it. My Undiscovered game. I say the Undiscovered game that I initiated playing with Sam Lorenzo and Helma is a good example of saying, what are we doing here with this kind of material in our role-playing books? And Undiscovered offering something which really was, a huge kaleidoscope of cringes and insight, which is often the case, a huge kaleidoscope of those things in the same text. So when one is presented with such a text for a game book, the opportunity to say, well, we want to dive into this and do a thing with it, and we don't know what we're going to say. We will know what we say by doing, as opposed to pretending and posturing about what we would say in the, the coffee shop discussion or the online forum proclamation. So this, I think, is a really strong thing. I think it's a great topic, and I think it needs to be, brutally addressed. And I also think that everybody's going to have their own bits to take, or their own, how would I say that? Their own specificity, right? Their own individuality, their own experiences, their own takes, which I trust you will understand is not the same as whatever virtue signaling. And I know, oh, it's a terrible thing. Conservatives say liberals. No, everybody virtue signals. Okay. That's everyone. And that's what I think we need to stop doing. I think we need to play. I think we need to take the bull by the horns and to actually do this stuff and see what we think and say about it, because you'll see it in how we play it. And that's what I'd like to know about this Lone Wolf and Cub game. I know the people involved, at least a couple of the people involved in the game, they are no slouches in regard to the topics being raised. And so, yes, I think it'd be a good idea. We should follow up.